Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dorsey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association, and I am your webcast moderator. Today is Friday, October 18th, and we will hear Planning Pioneer or Planning Pariah, Rethinking Bartholomew's Legacy. I've been waiting for this webinar. This is going to be a good discussion today. For technical help during today's webcast, you can type your questions in the Q&A box and I'll do my best to answer those. For questions related to the presentation, again, just type them in the Q&A box and we'll get to those at the end of the presentation during a designated Q&A period. I do ask that if your question is for a particular panelist, if you could state that in the question, that just helps me field through everything and keep things moving nicely. Today's guest hosts, we are sponsored by the APA Urban Design and Preservation Division in conjunction with the APA National Capital Area chapter. So this is fun. Thank you for joining us today and bringing this webinar to us. Coming up on your screen is a list of our upcoming sessions. Man, we have a packed fall season. You will see on there too, we have a law session coming up and we will have an ethics session, don't worry. So you will have both of those available to you by the end of the year. So stay tuned for that. You can register for these and all of our upcoming sessions at ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. Today's session is worth 1.5 CM credits and 1 equity credit. You can log those AICP credits by heading over to planning.org, log into your My APA account. And from there, you can search by today's title or event number, both of which can be found on our website. Again, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. Let's be friends. If you're on social media, be sure to like us on Facebook. That's where I post any important date or time changes, when new sessions are available for you to register for, and a reminder of what's on tap this Friday. We record all of our sessions and we post them to our YouTube channel. So head over to YouTube, type in Planning Webcast, and we'll pop up along with our well over 500 session recordings, all available to you for free. So be sure to subscribe to our channel so that you get updated when new sessions have been posted. All right, that's the end of my housekeeping items. Again, if you have questions for me, technical questions, or for our panelists, type them in the Q&A box. We don't utilize hand raises or anything like that, so just keep them in that Q&A box and we'll get to those. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I am going to turn it over to you, Melissa, to kick things off.
Great, thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you, Christine, for having us for your planning webinar series. I'm Melissa Linshaw, the urban planner with the National Capital Planning Commission, and will be moderating today's session. I would like to acknowledge APA's Urban Design and Preservation Division, as well as APA's National Capital Area chapter for hosting this webinar. I have the pleasure of serving as the Vice President of Membership for APA and CAC. Both division and chapter work on providing meaningful events for their members and hope you join us for more in the future. I'd also like to take a moment and acknowledge that 2024 marks the 100th anniversary of the National Capital Planning Commission's founding. NCPC is the federal agency for our nation's capital, but until Home Rule, it was also the planning agency for the entire city of Washington, D.C. So today's session is being presented as part of our centennial. Over the past century, NCPC has helped plan Washington's iconic monumental core, its extensive network of parks, and the transportation systems that Washington area residents rely on. However, our centennial is more than a celebration. It's also an opportunity to acknowledge inequities created by the past planning practices and consider lessons learned as we look to planning for the capital's future. We're very excited today to discuss a very thought-provoking idea. Named a planning pioneer by the American Planning Association, Harland Bartholomew had a profound impact on the planning profession, formalizing the use of zoning and comprehensive plans and shaping transportation and housing practices nationwide. These planning practices shaped today's communities and created and sustained racial and economic segregation. This webinar will explore the complicated legacy of Harland Bartholomew nationwide and in the three cities, Louisville, Kentucky, St. Louis, Missouri, and Washington, D.C. The panel will also discuss measures to identify and address these legacies in the built environment today. As a planning consultant and later the National Capital Planning Commission chair, Harland Bartholomew profoundly shaped the physical and social landscape of Washington, D.C., as well as other cities around the nation. He was known for being a planning pioneer and one of the country's first planning professionals who worked in over 700 communities. The U.S. American Society of Civil Engineers Harland Bartholomew Award recognizes special contributions to the role of civil engineer in planning and development. However, his legacies also included top-down elitist practices, institutionalized segregation, racialized displacement, and physically disconnected communities. And so our wonderful speakers will discuss this further. And here is our expert panel, and they'll discuss Harland Bartholomew's work nationally in St. Louis, Louisville, and Washington, highlighting his complex legacy and the racial inequities impact of his planning work over time. I'd like to introduce each one really quickly before we get started into the presentations. Today we have Dr. Mark Benton, an assistant research professor at the University of Missouri College of Health Sciences for health policy. His research focuses on equity in public settings, such as program evaluation, health access, and local government. His scholarly publications and interests include health equity, program evaluation, public administration, and public management. Early in his academic career, he researched and published on Harland Bartholomew's career and impact. And we have Don Rowe joining us. He's the executive director of the Planning and Urban Design Agency in St. Louis, Missouri. Don is an outspoken advocate for planning and has held management positions in the city since 1989 and is reported to 5 mayors. He has also served as a private consultant for both for-profit and nonprofit organizations in older Midwestern inner cities, rapid growing communities in the Western United States, as well as small New England communities. He's an active member in American Planning Association and is the second longest serving planning director in the Big City Planners Institute. We'll also have Joel Dock, the planning supervisor for Louisville's Metro Office of Planning. He's a graduate of the University of Louisville's Department of Geographic and Environmental Sciences. Applying geographic methods to city planning, along with the historical knowledge of regulatory practices, he's enabled Joel to develop a comprehensive understanding of how land use regulations shape city landscapes. Joel is currently responsible for managing the Land Development Code reform, zoning map amendments, and the Board of Zoning Adjustment, along with maintaining the interactive exhibit, Confronting Racism in City Planning and Zoning. To round out our expert panels, we have Marcela Costa, the Executive Director of the federal government's National Capital Planning Commission, and leads a team of urban planners, architects, historic preservationists, and other professionals committed to preserving and enhancing extraordinary qualities of America's capital city and the national capital region. The commission provides long-term planning guidance for federal land and buildings in the region. Marcel also chairs the Urban Design and Preservation Division of the American Planning Association. And with that, I will let Dr. Mark Benton begin his presentation.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that excellent introduction. After we go into the next slide. So that introduction was excellent. And so just a little bit more about me. Like was said, assistant research professor at Center for Health Policy in the Department of Public Health at the University of Missouri. And I've published on Harland Bartholomew's planning, which fits into a broader research agenda. Next slide, please. My own positionality to this project, I'm speaking from the perspective of my own research and not from experience of race. My own identity is as a white man who grew up in a rural area, engaged most with planning research between the making of Ferguson and The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. Next slide, please. So this is a record I obtained from the Stoneham, Massachusetts town clerk. This is a record of Harland Bartholomew's birth. You can see occupation of father, shoemaker, Throughout the presentation, I'll be referring to Eldridge Lovelace's biography as a major source for a lot of this information. Um, I'm told that it wouldn't be uncommon for someone to have multiple professions in that region. Next slide, please. So based on the Lovelace biography, Harland Bartholomew and his contributions to American urban planning, Harland Bartholomew gained planning experience in New Jersey with Goodrich and Ford. In the earliest portions of his career. Later, he moved to St. Louis, becoming the city's first-time planner and the first full-time planner hired by a city. Not really the first planner in all of history, but certainly represents a shifting from more of a pursuit to really professionalizing planning. He worked nationally after establishing a home base in St. Louis and would go on to become part of the National Capital Planning Commission. Over the course of his career, he would plan over 400 cities, according to the biography, and pioneers and systematized comprehensive planning with major components of streets, transit, transportation, recreation, zoning, and art. Next slide, please. Next slide. And so his firm, Harland Bartholomew and Associates, was based in St. Louis, but worked nationally and had great influence in those 400 cities. Bartholomew took an interdisciplinary approach to plans, which means the way he organized it, or it was organized, was in a matrix organization. So you might have both someone being managed by a landscape architecture lead, for example, while also being managed by a project lead. And so two different lines of authority within that organization. Generally, he has been compared to Robert Moses, both in terms of scale and impact, and more recently, if it would say, in terms of notoriety as well. His career flourished most of all in the first half of the 20th century, which was a time of urbanization, rationalization, and migration. The United States was going through a great time of continuing and ongoing urbanization, modernization of technology, and both internal and external immigration. And Bartholomew's planning was in part a values and moral response to that, an expression of his values. Next slide, please. Bartholomew termed his planning as city scientific, a very top-down approach, sometimes criticized as boilerplates, and many of his plans you will find a lot of similar sections: that's street, transit, transportation, recreation, zoning, and art. He would go on to assert consistent relationships between space and people, arguing that the appropriate arrangement of space could result in this consistent, improved city. As a rule, both in public and private correspondences, he was strong against varying from the plan and would nearly always recommend against it. He was also a strong proponent of neighborhood units, which I will discuss a little bit more in our next slide. So this is Lafayette, a neighborhood in St. Louis. On the left, this was from Harland Bartholomew's 1947 St. Louis City Plan. And so on the left, you can see he's charted out land use in the portion of the city. And on the right, compared it to the actual zoning of that same area. And there are really three things I would like to draw your attention to for really this. He did consider this to be a unit, and you can see the different uses that he was advocating for. The text of the plan itself draws much attention to the mismatch between land use and zoning, arguing that it produces unoptimal results for the city. Two, I would like to draw attention to the fact that Bartholomew often is criticized for single-use zoning, but we can see in the right zoning panel that there are a multitude of uses within this single neighborhood, although it certainly does reduce the uses and the diversity within this neighborhood. And as an aside, this plan would argue for taking this park area, Lafayette Park, if you're familiar with the St. Louis area, and replacing this with single family residencies. So in that, we see this commitment very much to order and also to this organizing of the neighborhood unit in a rational way that he believed would optimize the overall city. Next slide, please. So Bartholomew, as was noted earlier, has been associated greatly with segregation in cities all over the country. There are quotations where Bartholomew explicitly advocated for racial and social segregation, and certainly more examples where his planning occurred in a segregated city that maintained that segregation. I think when discussing this topic, it is also important to note that Bartholomew was not a lone actor in the ways that planning could enable segregation. It did so in a concert with a variety of other actors, realty, government, the private sector. But generally, after the Buchanan versus Worley Supreme Court decision, where sort of explicitly racial zoning was disallowed, he was able to use planning to renew, ossify, and entrench segregation through these strategically applied city plans and planning requirements. Next slide. And so finally, when thinking about Bartholomew, one final idea I would like to draw attention to is the limitations of his influence. As I mentioned, to the extent that he enabled segregation, he did so in concert with others. He played within a network of individuals and institutions, but he was not the sole determiner of American cities. And there are also challenges in figuring out exactly lines of attribution and responsibility. It's difficult to disentangle racism and segregation in American culture, planning culture, his approach and the culture he created in his firm, and direct delegations he made within his firm. But that is my general introduction to Harland Bartholomew. And I am excited to hear what the rest of our panelists have to say on the topic. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Next, we're going to hear from Don Rowe.
Yeah.
We're ready.
So, thank you, everybody. Don Rowe, the Executive Director of the Planning and Urban Design Agency in the city of St. Louis. I'd love to be talking about current planning in St. Louis, and I will at the end of this with a little bit of weaving in of something from his legacy that we've recently turned into a positive. Next slide, please. Yep, so on my agenda, we'll talk about Harland Bartholomew in St. Louis, race and blight, and how that was interconnected. And planning for blight and development, but we're going to also remind ourselves that it's really decadence that he did and obsolescence as to what the format ended up being for his establishment of some of the actions he took from the top down. But we will go into zoning, urban renewal, and predating interstates, highways, and now that have turned into interstates, and some legacy about public green space. Next slide. So a couple things. We'll start. I'm going to show a lot of maps. We're addicted to maps, Any map that you see with this shape that sort of looks like a pepper, north is to the top, and it's a computer-generated map by us, contemporary. St. Louis was founded in 1768, became an independent city in 1876. And why that's important is we separated from the county. It was called the Great Divorce. But we've been fixed at that 62 square miles ever since that time. So there's no annexation into the west, into Missouri, and the eastern border is the Mississippi River. Population in 1880, 310. Population when Bartholomew came to St. Louis, 62 square miles, 772,000. His high in 1950 was 856,000. And there is the 2020 population, same 62 square miles, we're down to about 300. Let's move on. Yeah, he's St. Louis's first planner. We've talked about others about the legacy of first planning, but I want to say he was city planner and engineer. And I see some aspects of that, of course, that I will weave into here. There's a number of these big things that he did: a comprehensive plan in 1916, and streets plan, zoning plan, transportation plan, St. Louis regional plan, and a 1947 comprehensive plan. At the end, I want to talk about our new comprehensive planning and other parts we're doing in the city of St. Louis. But let's go to the next slide. Oh yeah, so Mark spoke, and this is a quote from him. Bartholomew's concerns were founded, his analysis correct, but his solutions ignore the lives of Black slum populations. In the Q&A, I may talk a little bit more about this. It's sort of stunning to look at some material and see how his analysis was, and then see how it came to be things implemented from the top down, and certainly influencing and ignoring the positive aspects of our African-American population. Next slide. Just to give you a little bit of a context of all things we're working in during his time, this was the time when agreements had racial consequences in loans. It was how things were in our city with playgrounds. You can see how it's also in population and the school population and the African-American concentration at that time. Next slide. Key and important in all this, and again, looking at the map, you can see where there were racial covenants in our north-south map between 1850 and 1950. There's a strong concentration in two parts of the city, the north part and the south part. And in these court cases, Supreme Court cases, the first one found that the government cannot enforce racially based housing ordinances. Talked about the role of his work in zoning, but also of the realtors and whatnot. Private racial covenants grew. There were over 100,000 restrictive deeds in St. Louis City and County in that 100-year period. And then in 1948, from a St. Louis case, the home is pictured here. It's the Ville neighborhood of St. Louis, a predominantly African-American stronghold that has survived many types of pressures put on from our population and our history, but found that even private racial restrictive covenants were unconstitutional. Big step. Here, just going back to, this is Harland Bartholomew, and the map on the right is computer generated just using the 1937 homeowners loan corporation designations. To be related to this map, you're going to see several times from the 1947 comp plan. And two legends, the dark color, areas of decadence and obsolescence, 7.4% of the city. Plan says must be cleared and reconstructed. And remember, we have a pretty full population here, 800 plus thousand. And then the areas of blight, over a quarter of the city, should be extensively rehabbed before they degenerate into obsolete areas. Key stuff from his primary plan from 1947. Let's go to the next slide. This is just to zoom in a little bit. Again, we've oriented it so that one map you saw before with some zeroing in on some data from the census. And to drive these points home, these blighted and obsolete areas line up with the most dense populations of Black residents. So we've highlighted that, and those areas in yellow are range from having a 20% to a 73% Black population at the time. So it's using this treatment of some technical things of blight and obsolescence, but it's really targeted to these African-American parts of the city. Next slide, please. So this is just here to be part of his document to just take up what that is saying at the very bottom. This cancerous growth, those types of areas, may engulf the entire city if steps are not taken to prevent it. Ooh, let's go on. The comprehensive plan it's a unified map. Again, this is his original document. So it's turned on the side here. But relevant planning activities that he'd done for years, enacted the new restricted zoning, set the stage for the supposedly direct investment, facilitated urban renewal and determined routes for future interstates, continued public land and for public green space was helpful, even had some airports. Next slide. Oh, okay, so we're just going to show you the 1950 zoning map. Look at the colors. All the yellow is single family, and then we're repeating and just superimposing on the city map the reminder of that homeowners loan corporations ratings of the C and D, the toughest. Next slide, please. I'm going to go in here a little bit in the comp plan, having this idea for expressways and highways. And the one on the left is, we've highlighted it from the comp plan. The line that goes to north-south in the middle there, that was never built. We have some current aerial imagery with areas that do have these modern interstate highways and Forest Park expressways. Look at the three rectangles. The one that's in the middle of the screen would just show, and we're not going to do a more detailed than that one, of a direct cut through a park. Let's go to the next slide. And oh, bingo. That one that went across, went through Mill Creek Valley, really cut through. The city was populated out. This just shows the level of impact and displacement that happened here. Let's go one more. And this is going to be wrapping up. We're now focusing on downtown. The one to the left that looked like one of those hammers you break a glass window with in your car is 22 acres. That's a 2018 picture. That's all interstate type limited access highway created that was on his plan. 22 acres. You see it interchanges with a interstate. Does connect to some city land streets in the downtown, but really is a highway that you can see some stubby ends that were pointed to North St. Louis, would divide yet another part. These 18th Street today, now within the last 5 years, all 22 acres are owned now in a commercial way for our St. Louis soccer club. You see its stadium to the north end of this. You can see it here in the upper right and the view to the arch. Let's go to the next. This is just a plan view of downtown. The river's to the right, the arch grounds. You can see the square that is the rectangle square for the soccer stadium, a greenway in between. Some of that open space was envisioned by Harland Bartholomew. We'll see the next slide. And yes, so over time, that very in the center shows where the arch was to became and the clearance there. And the punchline is the arch is the key feature on a waterfront. You look through it now, it's been reestablished through a design competition, and through the arch, you get to see that green space all the way now, not ending at a terminus that was a highway to nowhere, but our soccer stadium. And one more, and just planning today is a very special feature that the Planning and Urban Design Agency was established in 1999. Prior to 1999, planning had gotten very dissipated in the city, but we're underway these things: economic justice action plan, changes to the zoning, a new comprehensive plan with land use, zoning overhaul following that, transit and mobility, citywide sustainability plan, historic preservation, neighborhood planning, all underway very robustly with top consultants. And I'll leave you with one more map. Is we're doing that planning, neighborhoods will be specific, but citywide. And the vacancy is, as you see it, substantial amount of vacancy, primarily in North City, both land bank owned properties and privately owned properties. But the concentration of that is extreme in North City. There are portions of the city with still the same population density per square mile of 1950, but not North City, not where the African-American population is primary. Thank you. Next slide, and we'll wrap it up.
All right, thank you, Don. And now I'll hear from Joel.
Yes, good afternoon, and thank you for having me, and thank you for allowing Louisville to be represented on this panel today. You can go on to the next slide, please. So just a little bit of background on Louisville, Kentucky. We are a consolidated city-county government known as Louisville Metro. We, as planners, make and plan for over 400 square miles. We've got a population of about 800,000. It's 70% white, 23% black, 6% Hispanic. We've got about an 8.5% foreign-born population. Median household income is around $62,000, and we have a 15% poverty rate. Louisville is located at the Falls of the Ohio along the Ohio River. We're west of Cincinnati, south of Indianapolis, and north of Nashville. So just to begin, the content that's being presented today in a 10-minute format is part of ongoing efforts to revise and reform our land use laws contained within the Land Development Code to resolve the legacy of discrimination and inequities brought about by our zoning laws and regulations. And to do so, we have to confront our past, fully acknowledge our past in order to move forward. I do want to state that, as I present this topic, it is important for me to acknowledge that as a white male planner, I speak from my own professional experience, education, and lived experience. Next slide, please. I think as others have mentioned, Buchanan v. Worley. Buchanan v. Worley was a case born out of Louisville, Kentucky. This stemmed from a racial segregation ordinance passed in 1914 that said that if the block was 50% white, someone of the other race couldn't move in and vice versa. This was ultimately struck down in the Buchanan v. Worley decision of 1917. This racial segregation ordinance was not particularly unique to the city of Louisville, as Baltimore in 1910 was the first to pass such a racial housing ordinance, and it swept across the Midwest and South at the time. Next slide, please. So we're covering the topic today. We're talking about Harland Bartholomew specifically and his impact. So he was hired in 1929. He consulted for Louisville and Jefferson County at the time through the 1950s. As Dr. Mark Benton noted, Bartholomew applied a scientific approach to city planning. He performed an extensive analysis of plumbing, prevailing winds, housing maintenance, decadence and obsolescence, the affordance of light and air upon dwellings. His contributions in this realm of planning, as well as transportation and streetcar networking, was immense, specifically in Louisville. Next slide, please. However, in being a scientific city planner, and Don had alluded to this cancerous effect, Bartholomew describes cities using organic metaphors. He used blight to imply that a contagion existed within a city. This was a contagion that needed to be removed, discarded, and prevented from spreading. And what we found in our work that we have published in our interactive exhibit, Confronting Racism, is that when blight is used specifically, and what is not said in many of these comprehensive plans that were not facially racist, but were intended to restrict and remove the Black population from communities, was that Bartholomew believed and put forward that the worst form of blighting effect by adverse tendency are those of racial invasions, more particularly those of the colored race. And so zoning was used as a tool to segregate the population specifically. Next slide, please. So again, to combat this blighting effect that was occurring or purported to be occurring, exclusionary zoning was promoted to protect predominantly white, single-family neighborhoods and future growth. Next slide, please. Now, in these documents, as we found out from the Buchanan decision, Euclid, and the court cases that came before Euclid, zoning regulations could not be facially racist. There were other components within plans where race and segregation was the rule of law, schools and parks at the time. So we looked to our recreation section to find out more information about what was happening to our neighborhoods and how exclusionary zoning was being used. So in the 1931 comprehensive plan, which Harland Bartholomew performed for the city of Louisville, single-family zoning was used to insulate new school sites, amenities, and services. These are, these are areas where amenities and services still remain to be hoarded, specifically in areas of predominantly white, wealthier communities. So at the time, this document said that schools were to be abandoned areas. Schools were either on major thoroughfares. Schools were either, in areas where industrial growth was coming in, or these schools needed to be abandoned and new schools proposed and insulated by single-family zoning where Negroes were gradually displacing the white population, is the quote from that document. Next slide, please. In 1932, the city of Louisville hired Bartholomew to produce what would be called the Negro housing problem in Louisville. This is where we find out a lot more information about what Bartholomew was thinking, about what city leaders were thinking, about the society contained within properties that were not were run down, as they called them. They were blighted structures. But what was contained underneath all of that was the ideology that if it was possible to create among the Negro masses a real desire for decent accommodations, the slums would automatically eliminate themselves. So as Don noted in his presentation, when he discussed, the analysis correct, but the solution ignored the lives of Black slum populations, this study specifically did that. And it said the only real cure is the large-scale clearance and removal of those populations. Next slide, please. So again, Harland Bartholomew was contracted in Louisville from 1929 up through the 1958 comprehensive plan. Correspondences went back and forth over that time. He was he was the planner for the 31 comprehensive plan. He was the planner who wrote the study that I was just discussing. And in the 1958 comprehensive plan, Harland Bartholomew and Associates advised Louisville to further engage in urban renewal and slum clearance programming, essentially to further engage in the restriction and the removal of the Black population from certain areas. He promoted the condemnation of land for resale to private interests to eradicate blight. What I'm showing you on the street is, or on the screen right here, was the Black business district of Louisville, a thriving community up until it was slated for urban renewal, and it was essentially eradicated. And presently today, it contains surface parking lots. There is one building, the Mammoth Life Insurance Building, which was a Black-owned insurance company. It is one of the few buildings left. However, you would not even be able to tell that it was a brick building under its metal facade. Next slide, please. So recognizing that Shelley v. Kramer said that courts can no longer enforce racial covenants, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or those residential securities maps producers, was disbanded in the 1950s. New tools needed to be introduced to accompany zoning to further prevent this blight and to insulate single-family communities, predominantly white and wealthier communities. This document called for the protection of standard residential areas, much like the quote that you saw at the beginning of this presentation about the goal of zoning in St. Louis. And it called for one of the most effective measures for obtaining concerted and continuous protection of good residential neighborhoods is the formation of neighborhood improvement associations. It called for these neighborhood improvement and protection associations to fight off even changes from developers and to fight off changes that the city may have in the future that may result in changes to those exclusionarily zoned areas. Next slide, please. So I think it's important to begin or to end on this history evaluation with, again, getting back to Buchanan v. Worley. That's prior to Bartholomew. That's prior to Euclid. The ideology at the time, he did not single-handedly hold by himself. In a study on blighting effects and decentralization influences in downtown Louisville, this ideology that Blacks themselves would cause a depreciation of value was evident when it was said that, you know, like uses will create higher values. And this applies to all forms of residential property. Where different economic classes and racial characteristics are mingled, values will be lower than in a homogeneous district. Single-family zoning was the tool used to create homogeneous, exclusive single-family zoning districts. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to quickly roll through a few things just to show the legacy of this 100 years of planning now in Louisville. Once things are put in place, they're very hard to undo. 75% of the land here in Louisville is single-family zoning. You can see how that yellow matches the movement of the white population from 1940 to 2010 out of West Louisville. West Louisville was also hit by a flood in 1937. And when we talk about white flight in Louisville, we are talking about white flight from western portions of the city. There is a statistically significant correlation between single-family zoning and race, income, and poverty. Next slide, please. And with these slides, you can actually just kind of roll through. Just keep in mind the yellow, that is single-family zoning, the correlations between household income and single-family zoning. Your next slide will show poverty in Louisville. This one shows property value and then poverty. We are addressing this. And so, as I mentioned at the beginning, this content is all part of our ongoing efforts to reform our land use regulations. This began in earnest in the summer of 2020 during the height of the racial and social justice movement that swept across the nation and hit home specifically here in Louisville, Kentucky. And so we have been looking at ways to bring about more equity within our land use regulations, not only by changing our land use regulations, but changing how we interact, changing how we engage with the community, changing how we speak about planning policies. And most importantly, we are confronting and fully acknowledging the past that has led to the current patterns of racial and socioeconomic segregation that we have ourselves in today. Next slide, please. One of the things that we are pursuing, we have adopted accessory dwelling units provision. So we are opening up these exclusionary single-family zoning districts to more opportunities where more opportunities are appropriately located. Accessory dwelling units are now permitted in all districts in Louisville Metro. And we are pursuing middle housing changes to open up our neighborhoods to different types of housing, duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes. What is often found in older neighborhoods that were developed and designed before zoning came into effect, and the types of things that we as planners talk about, mixed-use neighborhoods, walkable neighborhoods. We need a return to that. And middle housing has been made illegal in these areas where it exists, and it is missing in these areas where it has always been illegal. Next slide, please. You can check out our website, louisvilleky.gov/LDC reform, find all kinds of information about our reform. You can also view the Confronting Racism in City Planning story map and interactive exhibit. And next slide, please. And I just, again, want to thank everyone for the time to speak on this topic on a national stage. And thank you for allowing Louisville to be represented today.
Thank you, Joel Doug. And so now we will hear from Marcel Acosta.
Well, thank you so much, Melissa. And was really some great presentations that we heard earlier today. As Melissa mentioned, this year is the NCPC, or the National Capital Planning Commission's 100th year. This is our centennial. So this time we decided to take a closer look at Harland Bartholomew and his complex legacy as we marked our anniversary. So many of you know that Washington is a planned city, and many of you are very likely familiar with our historic plans, like the L'Enfant Plan and the Macmillan Commission plans that really shaped the form of our city that we know it today. But also, Washington 20th century development was deeply impacted by Harland Bartholomew. So much of what you see in Washington, D.C., our nation's capital, is really a result of all these three plans. But I think a lot of it is really because of Harland Bartholomew's work. Next slide. So let me give you some background on NCPC and Washington, D.C. in general, because I think it's really helpful to understand the impact of Bartholomew's work in the nation's capital. NCPC is the federal government's central planning agency in the National Capital Region, which includes Washington, D.C., as well as the adjoining counties in Northern Virginia and Maryland. I think that went off. Okay. So NCPC was authorized or created by Congress in 1924, and we actually served as a primary planning agency, both locally and from the federal side, for the District of Columbia until 1974. The District of Columbia was federally controlled until the enactment of Home Rule in 1974, which gave the residents of the district the ability to elect the mayor and council and manage many local activities. So what's really interesting about the district, it was actually run until 50 years ago by federal commissioners that were appointed by the president. And it was only 50 years ago when the district received Home Rule and was able to elect the mayor and have local representation and also have a say in local decision-making as it affects their communities. Home Rule actually established a unique approach for planning in the nation's capital, where the newly established district government and NCPC now work in partnership to plan for the nation's capital and the local city. However, during the time of Harland Bartholomew's work, from the 1920s to the 1960s, Bartholomew worked as a consultant and then later commission chair of the NCPC. He was actually appointed by President Eisenhower to chair our commission. So planning was really at that time conducted by a federal agency, often led by people from outside the region and often subject to very hands-on direction from Congress. So again, there was no elected officials locally, no local representation on our commission, and very little opportunity for residents to have a voice in the city's development. So this is really a top-down approach which reflected the period's power structure at that time. Next slide, please. So Bartholomew's career and influence in Washington spanned multiple decades. He served as, again, a longtime consultant, and from 1953 to 1960 served as the chair of NCPC. He also brought newly emerging professional planning practices to the nation's capital. Many of the things that Don and Joel spoke about that happened in St. Louis and Louisville actually were also implemented in Washington, D.C. And he also championed, again, sweeping development to change Washington's urban form. And similarly to what the other panelists have discussed, his work in Washington covered zoning, comprehensive planning, redevelopment, and highway planning. Next slide. Can we go to the next slide? Thanks. So Bartholomew also prepared Washington's first zoning code as a consultant. This code established land use patterns that continue today. So you'll see here a zoning map from 1936. And you'll also see that much of upper Northwest Washington, the area in yellow, consists of single family, mostly white, high income housing development, while Southeast Washington contains much of the city's multifamily, minority, and low-income housing development. So for many of the same reasons that were discussed with Louisville and St. Louis, that also happened in DC. Next slide, please. So again, some of these patterns, which were also combined with loan practices, redlining, and other restrictions, effectively institutionalized racial and economic segregation. So also zoning shapes opportunities. So there are staggering disparities across the city from wealth to health outcomes. So the maps you see here also highlight racial population density on the left and the district's income distribution by race and location. Next slide. Again, as Bartholomew, as a consultant, also developed the first comprehensive plan for the Washington region. And really, Congress was the impetus behind the 1950 plan for the nation's capital. In a 1945 federal law authorizing land clearance and renewal in Washington, Congress required those activities to be consistent with a comprehensive plan. So Bartholomew's work, like the others said, was data-driven and systems-based. Bartholomew was, again, a longtime proponent of clearing and redeveloping what civic leaders considered to be problem areas. So using these approaches, he identified much of central Washington as problem areas, similar to the images that Joel showed. And while using these metrics of overcrowding or dwelling age, these areas were also always populated by low-income minority residents. So this plan really laid the groundwork for urban renewal, as well as highway-centered regional growth patterns, powerfully shaping 20th century development and also leading to sprawl, displacement, and regional disparities. Next slide. So NCPC and our colleagues in the district and across the region have been explicitly including equity consideration in our most recent comprehensive plans. Again, as was mentioned before, it is really challenging to quickly impact a century's worth of existing development and land use patterns. Next slide. Go to the next slide. So we're also grappling with these legacies in our zoning and comprehensive planning today. Our colleagues at the District Zoning Commission and the Office of Planning are rethinking zoning codes through an equity lens. And like so many other communities, local zoning codes are contributing to housing affordability challenges. Yet even as our understanding of the role of zoning and equity in housing problems, solutions are not always easy. So as somebody mentioned before, we've been exploring missing middle issues across the Potomac River in Arlington, Virginia. They actually came up with a groundbreaking zoning effort to provide missing middle housing that is now in litigation. Next slide. So throughout his career, Bartholomew believed highway development was critical to the mobility and vitality of our growing Washington region. He also continued to advocate for highways even as their negative impacts became clearer. So here's an example from the first comprehensive plan that he developed. It was really a 3-ring highway and arterial system for the region, which is shown to the left. The outer ring was really the basis for today's Capital Beltway. These smaller circles represent future federal facility locations. So this really represented a deliberate choice to support highway-based development and really direct growth, including the movement of federal agencies out of the District of Columbia. The smaller ring, which we know as the inner loop, was a highway system proposed within Washington, D.C. proper. So the reaction to highway development in Washington was immense. There was coalitions across the city forming to fight these proposals. The map to the right really shows the pink line showing which highways were actually completed, while the dashed lines show sections that were not developed. Next slide. So today, planners continue to look for ways to reduce the impact of highway barriers. In DC, Capitol Crossing, which is a mixed-use air rights development project, was built over part of the inner loop highway system adjacent to the Capitol. So really, I think here and in other cities, there have been efforts to either take down some of these highways or to deck over some of these freeways in order to heal the physical environment and also knit together or stitch together parts that were broken by previous highway planning. Next slide. So the photo to the left shows this large area of the city that was cleared for the Kennedy Center, which is the nation's cultural center, and the highways adjacent to it, all which remain stubbed out fragments of the inner loop. So during Bartholomew's chairmanship, NCPC helped site these facilities, both the highway and the Kennedy Center, and review the designs for both. Again, there are active proposals and ideas to deck over this highway infrastructure to better connect the Kennedy Center in the upper middle part of the rendering to the right to the National Mall, and you'll see the Lincoln Memorial on the far left side of the image. So really, this is a gateway to the monumental core of the nation's capital. Today, your arrival's really through seeing through the lens of highways about this important symbolic space. So to repair this and actually create a gateway that is worthy of this monumental core, but also adding some development potential to this area, something that and kind of stitching together the neighborhood to the east is really one of the goals that both the city and NCPC have been looking at. That should be something done in the future. Next slide. So in the 20th century, Washington was often a laboratory to test emerging national ideas with very few local guardrails, again, because of the power structure and the lack of local representation in local decision-making. With urban renewal and highway development, Bartholomew's plans were advanced. This is particularly true in Southwest Washington, the site of one of the nation's earliest and most complete urban renewal programs. So urban renewal in the Southwest really created a new residential neighborhood and a new federal office center, replacing the historic L'Enfant grid with super blocks and massive buildings by noted mid-century architects. It was also hailed a success by design professionals and civic leaders at that time, a place described as where the future comes to life. Next slide. But the impacts, as shown in some of the other city examples, together with highway development in this area, were enormous. Most of the neighborhoods were razed, about 13,000 people and many Black and poor were displaced, and about 1,500 businesses were also displaced as part of this urban renewal effort. Next slide. So while subsequent urban renewal proposals sought to allow residents to return, urban renewal shapes today's conversations about the continuing displacement of people who can't afford to live in our city and concerns about the impact of big plans, even as new development is proposed in Southwest. NCPC in recent years have developed plans to rethink the aging Southwest Federal Office Enclave into a more sustainable, walkable, and mixed-use neighborhood as buildings reach the end of their useful lives. So on the left, you will see the green spine of 10th Street Southwest spanning over the freeway to reconnect to the waterfront. And on the right are some first steps in recreating this connection. Next slide. So in 1952, Congress directed NCPC to develop what became a pivotal transportation plan that also highlights the complexity of Bartholomew's legacy. As the chair of NCPC, Bartholomew advanced the first substantive public transit plan in a generation, resulting in congressional action to establish a regional transit agency and vision as a model for the country. At the same time, the plan also advocated for over 300 miles of regional highways. So national funding for highways resulted in a regional system of beltways and arterials. This in turn supported the exodus of residents and businesses out of the city and into the suburbs, draining Washington of businesses, fueling suburban growth patterns, and giving rise to an east-west racially divided region. So while Bartholomew's work seeded the seeds or planted the seeds for the region's transit system, it was really his successor on the commission, Chair Libby Rowe, who was appointed by President Kennedy, and many others who have fought to have Congress divert funding from highways into what would become today's metro rail system. Next slide. So our regional system of highways and transit continued to shape development patterns. Over the last decade as a region, we've focused on expanding transit with projects like the Silver Line Metro expansion and the soon-to-be Purple Line Light Rail, and maximizing opportunities for transit-oriented development as part of an important regional growth strategy. Next slide. So in closing, even without considering the motivations, I want people to think about the consequences of Bartholomew's work to the built environment and to people in general. And I also want to share how we as planners in Washington are addressing this legacy in our work today. And as a planner and influential consultant, Bartholomew was a proponent of tools that we continue to use today, including comp plans and zoning. And as chair of the commission, when the federal government controlled planning and development in Washington, D.C., he was able to advance proposals that dramatically affected local residents. It was really the ultimate top-down elite model with very little room for public engagement. So while he was admired in his day, I think we acknowledged that his work also resulted in a physically segregated city and region by race and class, resulting in differing outcomes and opportunity and also a sprawling region. So addressing these impacts is complex and challenging. And as planners, I really look forward to continuing this discussion with my fellow panelists. And I also invite you, next slide, to visit our website to see our Centennial exhibit, to better understand the context of planning in Washington, D.C. and the impacts that it has had on our physical and economic and social landscapes, and also the other resources in our NCPC online library. So thank you so much, and that concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Marcel. And so I am going to move over to just kind of, we've had such a great presentation from across the board. So looking at really the history and then the actual impacts in the three cities. And so I really want to look at just that legacy of the last 100 years and how millions of people in the nation participate in and feel the effects of the planning work that touches so much of how we work, live, and play. And so now I have a question for the audience to actually answer. I believe Christine is going to pop up a question, a poll for us, and it will be, is Harland Bartholomew a planning pioneer or planning pariah? So I think she'll be putting that in soon. Yes, there you go. And please answer that question for us. And then we'll also kind of move into, feel free to ask more questions in our question and answer box, and we will get to them hopefully. And then I also wanted to propose just like kind of two questions really for the panelists before I open it up. And it's really, what would you recommend APA do with this planning pioneer? What could the organization do better to tell the story of the complex legacy of the individual? And then I'm also just interested in how planners, how we continue to do big plans, but we really have to have that self-awareness to know that some of our work may be flawed. And so how do you deal with that as a member of the planning profession? And can we learn from Harland's work in that regard? So those are two kind of questions I would like to have the panelists kind of ponder while, we got the results. And so here we go. Yes, but with lots of caveats is the clear winner here. So that's great. Feel free, panelists, to chime in on that as well. I really thank you, participants in the audience, for answering that question. And I'm going to stop sharing and kind of move it into our discussion.
I could start if you'd like.
Sure.
I think
Great.
with respect to your first question about APA itself, kind of reconsidering Harland Bartholomew being designated as a planning pioneer, I think that is there should be a discussion about that. I think, you know, and as some of you might know, NCPC is in the commemoration business. We approve memorials and museums in our nation's capital, and really the context is important. And having a discussion about why somebody is relevant to our profession and under what circumstances or the context of that time and what happened, I think all needs to be acknowledged. If you read the little statement on the APA website today, it was just really he was a pioneer because he was, you know, the first planning staff person. But I don't know if being the first planning staff person is reason enough to become a pioneer, even though it was a ramp up to professionalizing ourselves as professional planners. But I do think understanding that history, and if we're serious about discussions about equity, inclusion, and representation in our profession, we need to start by by what our association considers to be a pioneer or somebody of honor in this profession and why. And it's okay to have these discussions today, and as we are on this panel, and I think it deserves that sort of airing.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to piggyback on that, I mean, it's healthy to have these discussions. We should be constantly reevaluating the past to help us move forward. And there's really no pathway to get forward until we fully understand how we got here. And I think that's what we have attempted to do here in Louisville to move us forward. There's a number of different individuals that we should look back on across all professions and industries that we should just reevaluate the intent and dig as deep as we can. I think that's healthy, and we should be doing that regularly. You know, the other thing that we have to think about is this top-down approach to city planning that we've all noted. And I mentioned in my presentation, you know, it's not just about changing zoning rules and changing the laws. It's about how you go about doing it. And continuing to take a top-down approach of we know best isn't sustainable, and it's not appropriate. It's not equitable. And so it's important to make yourself, as a planner, make yourself available in the communities you work in and in the communities you serve. Go to the libraries, go to the community centers, walk the streets. Here in Louisville, we host what are called Zoning Matters conversations with the city planner. We've been doing this for 3 years now, where myself and other planners show up to the Louisville Free Public Library branches across Louisville, Jefferson County, and we just have conversations with people. We want to know what's fair in your neighborhood, what's not fair. What are things that we can do right now that are small that help you better understand planning and zoning, and know that we will continue to have conversations about bigger projects and bigger resolutions to some of the problems that we have pulled out as far as our history of racial and socioeconomic discrimination.
So one of the things to always remember, of course, is we can learn from our mistakes, and we can learn from the mistakes of others. So that's certainly the case here. One of the things that we're happy about is the creation of the Planning and Urban Design Agency in 1999. There's a legacy of planning that had ups and downs as to effectiveness and authoritarianism versus input prior to us. And I included a list of all the things that we're currently doing now, some of which have recently been underway in Louisville. And citizen engagement and involvement is active, because we have to be careful about the top-down approaches, either by politics or by Harland Bartholomew's ways. The aspect that I also sort of smile about in an odd way, because I have a family that's, many of them are engineers, is reminding ourselves that he was a planner. Well, he was a planner that double dipped, because he was our city planner and also doing this consulting work all over the place, but is also identified as an engineer. And I say that just in a context that where I view the planning profession is what we do best is to be concerned about people and place. And that's what we need to carry forward. He wasn't necessarily concerned about people as much as he should. And his work on place had many of those analytics that were sort of an engineering type. As I say that, the one thing that is in his legacy is doing things comprehensively. And I think it's important for all our jurisdictions to be thinking point to point, wall to wall, and putting things, layering things together comprehensively. So.
Yeah, just to add to that, there is some value about thinking in terms of, and I think somebody framed it as science, the quantitative aspects of planning, and also thinking in terms of system and being comprehensive in your approach. But, I think what we tend to lose sight of is kind of our planning is also influenced by values and perspectives, and that each of us brings to the table. And I think to the extent that we hide behind things that are quantitative or data-based and divorced from our own perceptions of kind of our cities and our opinions about people and places, I think needs to be more fully integrated and acknowledged as we do our work. We all bring biases to our work, and people in power have a way to amplify that and make that permanent, as we've seen through the past. So I think in terms of just professional development or professional ethics, I think that's a hugely important area that all of us need to kind of think through, that the way we conduct our work and the way we acknowledge our biases and our perspectives and our values and how we incorporate others' values into that conversation is hugely important. Or else you end up with the cities that we've seen decades past and kind of still kind of being perpetuated. So that's important for the profession.
And we have, as Joel was saying, the ability to do that in person. We're ability to do that by other types of media, but connecting with everybody that is our residents and users of our city and supporters of our city, the modern day level of community engagement is fundamental to have it be people-based.
Great, thank you. And I think, Christine, I think you're gonna open it up from the questions from attendees now.
Absolutely. So this first one is going to be for Dr. Benton. And it is, and I gotta say, this question came up a couple times. Were the areas of decadence and abstinence backed by any objective data other than just racial data? So, jurisdictions attempt to say why areas are in bad shape using like other data besides simply just race. So were they backed by anything else?
Oh, certainly, absolutely. And I'm hoping maybe others can speak to this as well. But I'm thinking, especially in St. Louis, some of those blighted and obsolescent areas sort of famously lacked indoor plumbing. And so they would do studies of these areas. They would absolutely go into these areas and note the conditions. Bartholomew was, I think, famous for conducting traffic studies where they would go out onto the streets and count how many cars go this way, that way, this way. So yes, they were backed up by non-racial data, but I think to connect it to this prior discussion, the importance of slow thinking and creativity is so paramount, because it is one thing to collect this data, but then another thing to what do you do with that knowledge that you now have. And it was not an approach, like was said, that necessarily took into great consideration the humans who were within that data.
Yeah, and I think I just want to, continue that conversation with an example from here in Louisville, Kentucky. And it's just, Bartholomew completely ignored the lives of the people that lived in these communities and failed to even acknowledge why certain communities existed in such states of disrepair and inadequate plumbing. Here in Louisville, we had a community called Little Africa. This was a post Reconstruction era area of freed African Americans. The community was built up with the material that was available, and it was in an area that was not a great area of land. It was a low-lying area, it was a swampy area, and it was built with the materials that were available. It became a prosperous community and social community where people relied on each other. This is similar to some of our other communities. And in the map that I showed on urban renewal, this was slated for urban renewal. The analysis, as Dr. Benton has noted, was correct. The homes were in terrible condition. But the solution of removal without any acknowledgement or any attempts at relocation or understanding that there was a population that existed beyond that is just a form and please read Dr. Benton's work, a form of administrative evil that Bartholomew perpetuated in conjunction with city leaders and elected officials.
And we certainly have that in St. Louis, and Mill Creek Valley certainly comes to the top of the list. One of the things I did point out was that we had been at the 62 square mile construct for our history since the late 1800s. So there's no annexation. There's no additional area that we've gone after. So other cities, of course, Washington, D.C. has some finites. Louisville has joined with their county. And a aspect of when we go around our city is both our history and our preservation role within city government has gone to be something that was architectural based to say the preservation arm of the city is the Office of Cultural Resources. So we protect our cultural assets within our city, how diverse they have been in the past and how continuing diverse they're getting with, we have an Office of New Americans to get settled here. But one of the things that's a physical feature for our city in our metropolitan area is the grid system of having been developed in that 62 square miles of the grid system and the inherent walkability that we have from that versus the other recognition for the St. Louis area as being one of the sprawl capitals of the United States is the areas around us. But the grid system, the fact that we have 110 city parks and during COVID, many of those were just outside your door and a walk away to make you have healthy outside time and to see neighbors from afar. So.
Next question, and like I too think about this a lot. Everyone's having a crisis on the line. What are we doing right now that in 20, 50 years, planners are going to look back on and go, what were they thinking? What are they? What are we doing wrong? How do we fix it? How, in all of your opinions, how do we look at what we're doing and, decide whether or not we think this is going to be good for the future? I know this is like a...
No, I'll start. I mean, we talk about this a lot in our office, and specifically with some studies we've been doing recently. Zoning is broken. And so to solve these problems through the use of zoning alone is not a solution. We have to find other mechanisms. We have to rely on forms. We have to rely on building types. We have to rely on other mechanisms of recognizing that the things that we talk about that are so great in communities existed before zoning. There were big sprawling plans, as Marcel noted, in DC and in Louisville. We have a system of Olmsted, Frederick Law Olmsted designed parks and parkway systems. Those are extremely important, and those were laid out prior to zoning. So I think we just have to take a hard look and say, okay, we cannot fix this problem by throwing more zoning on top of zoning and thinking that that's a solution. We have to, I think, find other mechanisms to doing that. And I think we have to recognize that our built environment is, while you can have some control, it is best left to occur naturally with the built and physical environments that we have today.
I mean, do we think that Euclidean zoning is going to even be around in 20, 50 years? Or are we going to be looking more to like our form-based codes and just a total zoning overhaul? I know in Ohio, communities left and right are doing all kinds of zoning code reform just from the angle of housing, just, to try to fix the problem. What do we think?
We can't forget that industrial next to residential isn't appropriate. And so,
Yeah.
And so in whatever function or form zoning takes in the future, there will be some measure of Euclidean zoning that remains, and that will be to do really the basic things that zoning should do, and that's protect people from nuisances. But what has evolved over the last 100 years is this idea that people living in different types of homes are a nuisance and that those should be prevented. And we just have to change that mentality across the board.
So one of the things that just occurred in the last week is the approval of a contract for our agency with outside consultants to do a complete zoning overhaul. We don't want to preempt as to what it really is, but it's not going to be tinkering. And I think that's an important milestone for us because we've done lots of tinkering to think anew. So that's going to be diligent and quite involved, and visionary is our goal. The other thing that I think we got to be careful about is one time when I was empowered by the mayor and people I was interacting with to ask, oh, wait a minute. I want to know what your department does. Planning can be involved in a lot of things. And in years past, I would get an answer of, now, why are you doing something that way? And they would say, because that's the way we've always done it. And obviously in the zoning realm, we're going to have an opportunity to double check and push forward. A thing that I think we have to be careful about, of course, is ignoring things that we know are on the tip of the iceberg to be trends. And we're a legacy city next to a river with a flood wall. We are ambitious about our sustainability aspects. And I think climate change, sustainability, we got to really be making sure that we haven't left every progressive step we can do about those things on the table in the next coming years, because we also have had the extraordinary rain events that within our community has caused flooding in ways that had never happened before. And that's something we have to look at and respect.
Yeah, I actually would agree with Don on that. That's a piece that actually might lead to a major restructuring of places and cities over the next century. And that this is natural hazards, climate change. A lot of these issues I think are more profound than just changing our zoning code. But it's also pretty overwhelming in terms of how to deal with it. And I think that's the one thing that we have to kind of get over is how do we make this manageable as an argument so people could take action. If it's too big of a idea or a problem, people won't want to deal with it. So I think it's incumbent upon planners to kind of think about how to make this manageable in terms of how people take action. So I think that's going to be our biggest challenge over time, depending on where you live.
I would agree with that. With sustainability issues, and to that, I would add, when coming up with solutions, it's important to consider who is considered within those solutions and who is, what parts of the city are not prioritized as well.
I think we have time for one more question. I'm trying to decide what that will be. We have so many really great questions. I guess this is getting into the weeds a little bit, but this question is, well, no, I don't want to go with that one either. All right, so can we comment on the wider global context of how 20th century modernism, Le Corbusier, remember him? We've talked about him in planning school before, replicated clearances in the name of renewal across so many jurisdictions, in some cases, irrespective of race. Can we comment? Does anyone have any comments on that?
I think I would just say it highlights the global impact of these ideas. You know, we think about this, and if I'll make my own reading recommendations, and I don't want to get this wrong. So it's called Cities of Tomorrow. You might have read that one in planning school, as well, by Peter Hall. And he goes into a lot of these concepts, and he really talks about the global impact of, I'll say, Western planning on the rest of the world. So I can highly recommend that to get an understanding of, you know, how these ideas were exported everywhere.
Yeah, I want to make two additional observations. I talked about the planning agency being reconstituted and empowered in 1999. There also was a regional effort in 2004, 100 years after the 1904 World's Fair with St. Louis was enforcement. And essentially following up on that effort in 2004, from that time to now, we've done two things focused in the city, but regional, that I think we would be, in a way, competitive toast if we had not done it. One is we designed and implemented the first phases of a light rail system to increase and be important to our density. And second, also voted in a special tax to do greenways and connectivities in the entire region. And our greenways are done in such a way that it gets people outside, stimulates economic development, and is connecting people to other people in many, many ways. And it's making particularly the newest, very ambitious event that includes philanthropy helping with it that will exceed $100 million that's in the city itself for greenways.
All right. We have to wrap up. It's 2:30. Thank you all for joining today. This was a really good discussion, and I think it really brings to light kind of us today as planners and what the impact we'll have on the future is. If you have questions for the panelists that we didn't get to, you can just email me and I'll forward those on to them. Don't forget to log your CM credits. We are recording the session. We'll post it on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/planningwebcast. And you can register for all of our upcoming sessions at ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. So thanks to all of you panelists for joining us today and all of our attendees. Thank you to the Urban Design and Preservation Division and the National Capital Area Chapter. We appreciate you. Everyone, have a great weekend, and we'll talk next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Enjoy your CM credits, everyone.